Hello everyone, my name is Paul and welcome back to the new news. I hope that everyone's having a fantastic evening, that you've had a wonderful middle part to your week. Pat yourselves on the back. You made it to Wednesday. You're officially through the first half of the week, and we're quickly getting ready to move into towards the weekend here. And there's been a lot that's been going on over the last 48 hours since we were last officially live here on the new news. Just a ton of stuff happening and developing inside the country of Ukraine, elsewhere as well. Lots of natural disasters, unfortunately, going on. But if you notice kind of a trend and you're watching the news in any way, shape, or form, regardless whether or not it's an independent media like myself, or you're talking about a mainstream media or kind of source, it's usually kind of depressing, isn't it? And that is just the kind of how the news works. I mean, that's just kind of what comes out in the news, unfortunately. But the good news is that here at the New News, the whole point of this channel is to be the news that gives back. And the way that we're able to do that is through you guys as the community. You guys have built an awesome community here. And then you guys allow us to be that news that gives back by checking out the video description below, where you see a ton, and I do mean a ton of different links to fundraisers and wonderful charity organizations and stuff down there. 80% or more of all the donations those organizations do receive go directly to their programs. I mean, they go directly to helping people throughout the world that are affected by the very same crises that we're talking about here every single day on the channel. So whether you want to support the war effort in Ukraine, support humanitarian efforts in Ukraine and around the globe, for a bunch of different causes, please feel free to jump down into that video description and support those wonderful organizations which we've listed down there. If you have more, please jump on our Discord. The link's also in the description, and let a staff member know. We would love to be able to know that. You could also tag us on Twitter if you would like and add us there. Of course, I am joined, as you may notice, by my co-host, Tally, back there, for those that like the cat. If you can't give a lot to these organizations, please give a little. If you can't give anything at all, that's okay too. Help us grow this channel. The more people that come here, the more of an impact we will have. And the more good that we'll be able to do throughout the world, the more money we'll be able to raise for charity and helping people throughout the world that are struggling with these causes. So give us that like, give us that subscribe, let your friends know about us. You can follow and share our stuff on Twitter and a bunch of other social media sites. It'd be fantastic. But you guys have built an awesome community. Thank you for the support you've given to us, but even more so to those wonderful organizations. Now, as we get ready to jump into the news itself, please feel free to ask questions. A lot of this can be relatively complicated. A lot of this has to deal with conflicts and stuff that I would know at least a little bit about. To give you a little bit of background on myself, so when you do ask these questions, if you're joining us live, then I'll be able to answer them. A little bit of background on myself. I was a corporal in the United States Marine Corps. I was an 0352 anti-tank missileman, which means that I operated the Javelin and the TOW anti-tank systems. I served between 2016 and 2020. My first tour overseas, I did 4.5 months in Syria and a month and a half in Kuwait, where I supported Operation Inherent Resolve. I was there as a Javelin gunner, conducting convoy escorts, deterrence missions, and others, and fighting the Islamic State. And then that was between October of 2017 and March of 2018. My second deployment, I went overseas to the Middle East once again. This was between October of 2019 and March of 2020, before I got out. And I went there as the Javelin team leader for the Crisis Response Company out of Kuwait, and also known as the TRAP Company. And then we went to the Baghdad Embassy Complex as one of the 100 Marines that went to the Baghdad Embassy Complex on New Year's of 2020 to respond to the ongoing crisis and protests there and to maintain security at the embassy, where I oversaw all anti-armor operations at the embassy compound there in Baghdad. And then I went to Saudi Arabia for some time right before I came back home, where I trained Saudi Arabian Marines that were getting ready to go to Yemen to fight against the Houthi rebels that were backed by Iran down in Yemen during the Civil War. So that is my subject matter expertise. I am a subject matter expert in anti-armor warfare and armored doctrine. I'm also a fully cross-trained machine gunner, a fully cross-trained rifleman, a partially cross-trained radio operator, and I'm also a combat lifesaver Marine. I am certified as a combat lifesaver or a CLS Marine, so I have provided medical aid and medical assistance to casualties when I was in Syria. So with that, Those are my subject matter expertise. Please feel free to ask questions. I'm watching the live chat if you're joining us live tonight. And if you have questions for other stuff too, there's a lot of stuff ongoing throughout the news. I try to stay very well rounded from a historical perspective, geopolitical perspective, economics, all of that stuff. I just have a really big interest in this, but I am not an expert in any of this. But I'll still try to answer your questions to the best of my ability. If I do not know, I will simply answer as such, because you cannot be an expert in anything. But with any of this information, always, I implore you as the viewer to please do your own research, subject matter expert or not. Please do your own research. Check out all of this stuff if you're very interested in it. These maps are actually on our website if you want to go and check out and read more into them, some of the associated articles, other works, or if you want to just kind of see what's going on and see and find out more information to do some of that research, please feel free. I provide this once again on our map every single night. So feel free to jump onto our website and pull that out. And with that, we jump right into the news here. We jump right down here and into Ukraine, where we start off with our special report with several different events happening around the Kiev area. So first of all, more missiles did strike Kiev. Russian cruise missiles, likely the Caliber system, the KH-101, ended up striking Kiev, once again terrorizing the local population and attempting to hit critical infrastructure throughout and around the city. At least 3 people were killed in the strikes. And we get that coming from a couple of different sources here. This is coming, quote, on October the 18th, Russian occupiers shelled and damaged the object of critical infrastructure in Desnyansky district of Kiev. As a result, there are power outages for the residents of the Troshnia housing estate and water supply. That's coming from the press service of the DTEK Kiev Electrical Networks. Quote, Russian occupiers shelled the object of energy supply in Kiev on October 18th. 3 people were killed. 1 person was injured. And that's coming from the press service of the Kiev's city prosecutor's office. And then once again today, quote, on October the 19th, Ukrainian air defense forces shot down several Russian cruise missiles in Kiev. That's coming from Vitaly Klitschko, who is the mayor of Kiev itself. We do have several different images and videos coming out from that here over the last 48 hours.
Yeah.
Coming from Ilya Ponomarenko, that's one of the missiles that were shot down today.
Well, they yelled for everybody to hide. Drone alert. But apparently, some of the cameramen decide. Crazy world. We're spending a fair amount of time looking up now.
And coming from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, these images coming out tonight. Russian hit energy infrastructure in Ukraine again. In Kiev, 3 people died this morning. They worked out one of 2 objects which were damaged today. Emergency services are working around the clock to maintain life in Ukrainian cities. And those rescue efforts do continue. Another interesting development today is the fact that Ukraine declared Chechen Republic of Ichkeria Russian-occupied territory. For those who don't know, Ichkeria is Chechnya. Chechnya is there in the southern part of Russia, next to Dagestan, over here. Most well-known part of it is Grozny. If I can get down here. There we go. down here in Grozny. And during the 90s, after the breakup of Russia, the Russian Federation had two different territories which refused to sign the Articles of Federation. One of them was Chechnya. Chechnya refused to do that, and that led to the Chechen Wars, the first and second Chechen Wars fought in the 90s and early 2000s, with insurgency that, to the point, even exists to this day. In fact, there are entire battalions of Chechen fighters that are fighting on the Ukrainian side, inside of Ukraine, against the Russian forces because they have lost the war in their homeland. And so this is something that continues, and because of this, Ukraine declared this area of the area of Chechnya as Russian-occupied territory because they did not peacefully sign the Article of Federation. Instead, they were bombed into submission with some horrendous atrocities and destruction committed in areas such as this battles for Grozny. In fact, even the leader of the Chechen people, Kadyrov, that's why many Chechens that are fighting pro-Russian Chechens are called Kadyrovites and not Chechens. Chechens were feared by the Russians. They acted very much like insurgents forces, but they also fought against. But they also maintained a very large cause, and they fought very fiercely. This is what makes them so revered, and especially in the Russian mindset, is because of how bloody they fought back against the Russians. However, Kadyrovites are not like that. Kadyrov actually, after the first battle of Grozny and between the first and the second Chechen wars, actually switched sides. He did fight for the Chechens, and then he swapped over to being pro-Russian and fought with the Russians as it seemed that they were going to be winning this war, in which, of course, they ended up doing so. And he fought on the Russian side during the second battle of Grozny, and then he actually continued on into where he is now, where he's been appointed as the head of Chechnya by Putin. But they did officially state that this is now Russian, that this area is Russian occupied territory. We get a child casualty update, which is always terrible to see, but it is one that is very important to report, as children are quite extensive casualties throughout this war. And what we see is this child casualty update coming from the Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine. Quote, since the beginning of Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine, 425 Ukrainian children have died, 815 children have been injured. Most victims among children are from the Donetsk region. Moreover, 251 Ukrainian children were reported missing, and 8,276 were deported. Now, under the Rome Statute of 1993 and under the 1949 Geneva Conventions, also known as the Four Geneva Conventions or Genocide Conventions, taking children from a group and transferring them to another group actually is a cause of genocide underneath the legal statutes and the legal definition for genocide and crimes of genocide. So this is one of the things that the International Criminal Court, International Court of Justice, and as well, of course, as Ukraine is documenting to ensure that these kind of crimes are documented and that they are underneath because the case being pushed for Ukraine inside of the International Criminal Court right now is that of genocide. And so far, from what we're seeing and going through it ourselves, the evidence, at least what has been shown publicly throughout the duration of this war, really points to acts of genocide and crimes against humanity. In fact, we'll get to that here later when we get into the international news towards the end of the night, because the United Nations officially came out with a report today as well regarding their investigation, and they even claim as such within that report. So it's definitely a big development on that front, and this type of rhetoric that we're seeing, these reports that we're getting from Ukrainian government agencies, is definitely in support. Is then reaffirmed and confirmed by the United Nations report that came out on the 18th, which was yesterday. Heroes for rehabilitation. We're seeing, of course, a lot of wounded that has occurred. Just because everyone is mostly focused on the Russian casualties and the significance of them as that number continues to quickly climb, we have to remember that this is a war of attrition. There are severe casualties on both sides of this war, and many of these troops need both physical and mental assistance and rehabilitation. 20-year-old Andrei Sobokovsky lost both legs when helping his comrades get out of debris. A Russian rocket hit their lodgings, killing 17 soldiers at once. So they are going through and they're actually getting prosthetics and rehabilitating their ability to walk with these prosthetics after suffering very traumatic injuries. So, but these kind of injuries are something that so many are dealing with, and it's something that really isn't focused on nearly as much. Several Ukrainian troops actually came over to the United States to get prosthetics as well, though we reported on that not too long ago. Armenian Tatul Ohanian lost both legs when his car ran into an anti-tank mine after his unit stopped a Russian column. He said, quote, "I saw a bright flash and realized that the car was on fire. I wanted to go out and see what happened. Opened the car door. My head spun and I fell. I looked at myself and saw that my left leg was completely gone. My right was barely holding on, and my clothes were on fire. I started to extinguish it. Unfortunately, I was wearing a bulletproof vest. It saved my life." And you see that he is already working with this prosthetics. But yes, both sides are seeing extensive casualties throughout the duration of this war, and that is likely to only increase as the brutality and the lethality of this war continue to increase as the weapon systems become, and as desperation on the Russian part really drives them to only worsen this conflict in many ways. We jump up here into Chernihiv, where a drone strike injured at least 3. Quote, Russian troops attacked Chernihiv with Iranian Shahed 136 kamikaze drones on October the 19th. 3 people were injured and hospitalized. 2 injured victims are in serious condition. And that's coming from Krylo Tomashenko, who is the deputy head of the President's Office of Ukraine. Jumping down here and into Kharkiv as we slowly move our way down and into where the majority of the fighting is taking place. We see major Russian strikes using cruise missiles hitting the CHPP-5 plant. It's a gas-fired plant on the outskirts of Kharkiv. At least one of the cruise missiles was suspected to be a KH-101 or caliber cruise missile, was destroyed by anti-air defenses right before it was able to strike the plant. However, it would appear that at least one missile did reach its target and did in fact hit the plant itself. This would not be the first time this plant was targeted by Russian forces, as this was actually something targeted much earlier in the war, or I say much earlier, it was targeted earlier in the war prior to the Kharkiv counteroffensives really taking root. And we continue to see them pummeling this as well, and this is going to knock out power for quite a few Ukrainians within this region, especially within the city of Kharkiv, which has already endured so much. It's very indescribable just how much has been endured here. But we can go ahead and we can actually see this video of this cruise missile as it's destroyed before it's able to impact the plant. Take a look.
Пидорасы ебаные попали.
So air defense systems do continue to put up as much of a fight as physically possible, but even in the words of President Zelensky himself, he only has what he suspects to be 10% of what he truly needs. Now, in light of the most recent attacks that have struck Ukrainian cities, mostly civilian population centers, and failing to hit their targets with any sort of accuracy, the Western countries and allied countries of Ukraine have been sending different types of weapon systems. For instance, Germany sent the Iris-T, which is the system they purchased for themselves initially. The first of 4 has already been delivered, and we are seeing evidence of its usage already on the front line. Several photos coming out today that I could not independently verify of these munitions having been after they were spent and struck their targets. But they're doing as much as they can, but unfortunately, Russia is using a tactic of saturation, meaning they're using so many drones and so many missiles being fired at once that it is almost impossible for really any air defense system in the world to truly knock out all of these. There will always be the 1 or 2 that do end up striking a target, maybe not the target, but a target somewhere. And for Russia, a target is anything that is Ukrainian. So that really kind of shows you kind of where we're at this war, is Russia may be expending these stockpiles much quicker than they were with these very precision-guided munitions, but they are doing so in order to saturate the air defense systems to where there's too many targets for them to properly engage in any meaningful way. Kharkiv itself, a 12-year-old boy is actually here in Kharkiv, and he was supposed to be starting the school year, but instead he has been inside the hospital. Russian rockets left a 12-year-old boy with an 8-centimeter wound inside of his head. He was unconscious for a week, and in fact in a coma, and after he couldn't walk and didn't recognize anyone. His sister has done everything to put him back on his feet, and the boy still cannot speak. An additional operation is unfortunately still needed. But the casualties amongst children especially is just absolutely horrendous. This war is already atrocious enough, but you start throwing children into the mix, as we do every time we report on the child casualty updates. He is unfortunately one of those statistics, and it's heartbreaking to see. It's tough to see, but he is doing much better now, which is great to see. Take a look.
Цьогоріч він мав би піти у 6-й клас, та Стас вже тривалий час у лікарняних палатах. Спершу був у Харкові, тепер у Львові. У нього складна травма голови. Разом з батьками хлопець поїхав до дідуся у село Грушоваха, що на Харківщині. І одного дня в їхній дім влучила ворожа ракета. Уламок потрапив Стасу у голову. Диво, що він взагалі вижив.
Його, виходить, чудо спасло. Те, що він просто закатився під кровать.
Та уламок ракети пробив у голові хлопця 8-сантиметровий отвір. Стаса одразу відвезли до реанімації у Харкові, прооперували. Далі кома. Лікарі не давали жодних надій.
У нього лиця взагалі не видно було. Він пухає увесь був, він перемотаний увесь був. Я кажу, синусь, я кажу, я тут, а він головою шевела, а не приходиш у тьому ще.
Після тижня у комі Стас врешті прийшов до тями. Не міг ходити і не впізнавав рідних. Прогнози були невтішні. Втім, сестра хлопця Оксана вирішила зробити усе, аби повернути його до життя.
Шансів так як не давали, ми боялися, що він взагалі не встане. Ну, слава Богу, за неділю я його підняла. Він почав потроху ходити, сидіти.
Та потрібна була ще одна операція. Родина прямує у Львів. Нейрохірургам першого медичного об'єднання вдається стабілізувати стан хлопчика. А опісля хлопцеві проводять складну операцію на череп. Отвір потрібно було закрити пластиною. Вона повторює кісткові структури, захищає мозок від ушкоджень та естетично виглядає. Її для Стаса виготовили індивідуально в США. Допомогли американські колеги із самою операцією. Зараз хлопець потроху оговтується, поки ще важко говорити і ходити. Втім, за якийсь час, кажуть медики, все буде гаразд. Приблизно півроку потрібно для повного відновлення.
Нічого, ми справимося, не?
So they ended up putting a plate in his head, but he is expecting to recover now after a very bleak outlook to begin with. But he is looking like he will be making at least a very good recovery, all in all, which is amazing to hear. But that is the toll. That is the toll. A war is not just centered on the battlefield, as so many instances in this war really show. It affects everyone's lives, no matter how large or small a war may be. This one being quite a large one, it affects everyone. Men, women, and children, and many in very horrific ways. Unfortunately, collateral damage and collateral loss of life are a fact that even the Geneva Convention understands and realizes that it is impossible to avoid such kind of things. However, when it comes to the Russians, the absolute level of destruction is incomprehensible, as they are using scorched earth tactics against Ukrainian-held cities. As we move down here and into Lyman, where we start to move into the Donetsk Oblast here. Here in Lyman, the bodies of 5 children were exhumed. An additional 8 bodies in total were exhumed, but 5 children, which were killed during Russian occupation, were exhumed by the Ukrainian National Police, which they ended up reporting on their official Twitter here. And this comes after the main excavations were completed not very long ago, in fact, just last week, regarding the main exhumation process there in Lemon. And we're expecting to see quite a few more as they do find additional graves. But once again, 5 graves of children were exhumed as a result, those being children killed during Russian occupation. This rolls us into the Donetsk daily update, where we find out that Russian aggressors have fired. So this comes from Pavel Korolenko, who is the head of the Donetsk Regional Military Administration, and he says, quote, Russian aggressors fired missiles at the Donetsk region on October the 17th. 6 people were killed and 8 citizens were injured. And for today, and keep in mind, these are 24 hours of delay. He does these at 8 a.m. the next day every morning, local time. Quote, Russian aggressors fired missiles at the Donetsk region on October the 18th. 4 people were killed, 12 citizens were injured. In addition, 8 bodies of Ukrainian civilians killed by Russian occupiers have been found in the city of Lemon. Once again, Pavel Korolenko. We can jump over here. So incendiary weapons usage in Bakhmut. We've seen quite a bit of incendiary weapons usage today. Incendiary weapons are banned under the Protocol 3 of the prohibition of certain conventional weapons, to which the Russian Federation is actually a party to, and also it breaks Protocol 1 of the Geneva Conventions and the limitations of usage of weaponry that is indiscriminate against civilian populations in highly populated areas. And it also breaks Rule number 85 of the International Humanitarian Law, which has kept record on the International Committee of the Red Cross's database, to which Russia is also a party to. But incendiary weapons usage is pretty terrible. Reportedly, this is seems to be from the Russian side of them firing Grad rockets, which are 122 millimeter Katyusha rockets, dumbfire. They are not guided in any way. And these then burst over the target area and spread incendiary munitions, usually intended to create smoke, such as white phosphorus, which is intended to create a smoke screen via artillery. In fact, the United States even still uses white phosphorus, or affectionately called Willie Pete, for this effect. However, using it on a population center is actually against the Geneva Conventions, and that's kind of what we're seeing here. Take a look. And you can see the effect I am talking about. This is a very good aerial shot from what appears to be a drone. And what you can see here is you can see where the weaponry air bursted, and what that means is it bursts above the target and then allows for the particles of those chemical particles to spread out as they are reacting. And you can see the trails as they're falling down here. And it spreads out over a wider area. It covers a much wider area, and it drops onto the target. And when it hits the ground, it ignites the ground on fire as well. Now, it might be a little bit more difficult considering it is getting into that wet season, that cold season. We're seeing that Rasputitsa once again here in the Donbass. But regardless, the point of this, you'll see it's this thick white smoke pouring off of this really indicates that this is likely white phosphorus, as that is what white phosphorus does give off, is a very thick white smoke, and it is used as a smoke round. Now, I don't normally see this out of a white phosphorus rounds whenever I've seen them being used in person, this type of airburst effect, but I am sure it is possible. But that's kind of what we're seeing here is the usage of incendiary munitions, usually intended to create smoke screens, being used, as you can clearly see, on a large population center, which is inherently a war crime just to do it, let alone the casualties of this, which are very likely either Ukrainian personnel or Ukrainian civilians, as these reactions do not stop. There is no meaningful way to put them out. They only stop once the chemical reaction stops. And these chemicals do burn at thousands of degrees Fahrenheit, meaning that it is simply too hot for most things to be able to put them out effectively to begin with. Up here, and this is in the Luhansk Oblast. This is over by Stara Krasnyanka, which is in between Kreminna and Rubizne. And we see another convoy that was destroyed with precision fires provided by Ukraine today. A Russian convoy over in this area was successfully destroyed as it went and hit into a wood line. It was a logistical convoy, and it was reportedly hit with HIMARS missiles, though we can't independently confirm what type of munitions were being used. This was successfully geolocated to this kind of outskirts of this wood line here, where these vehicles were successfully destroyed. And we do have the video of that. Take a look. So you can see them, they're identifying, it's a Russian logistical convoy. There are no these are military vehicles, but it's very clear these are logistical vehicles, not combat vehicles. And you see they're passing down over by this wood line, and they're pulling into this wood line for some cover and concealment here. But however, they're being spotted by a Ukrainian drone. And this allows them to be accurately targeted with precision guided munitions. Now, there's different types. This is definitely or I would say this is likely within range of the M777's Excalibur round, which I believe is the M989. Do not quote me on the number, on the round number designation, or the Dodec. I'm not certain on that, but these could be the Excalibur round, or they could be HIMARS or Mars 2 rockets, which are essentially the same thing. Regardless, these are definitely precision-guided fires. You can see the very accurate destruction of that Russian convoy there. We continue our trend down towards the south, where we see over here, this is in the city of Avdiivka, where once again shelling struck Avdiivka. Russian shelling continues to pound Avdiivka, which is located here in the Donetsk Oblast. It's right there on the northwestern part of the city of Donetsk, which is occupied by Russian forces. And once again, their strikes ended up hitting residential infrastructure, from what we're able to tell. And we do not know the casualties. However, once again, Russia is maintaining a scorched earth policy against Ukrainian-held cities, which is very. This is pretty reminiscent of what we see in other places as well on a daily basis. But you can see this is not a military target. This is an apartment complex. This is not being used as a military objective. It's not a headquarters. No, it is clearly an apartment building. And these rockets and missiles do carry a good punch, and you can see they're blowing out entire sections of the wall here. That we've seen them where they've collapsed parts of the buildings or entire buildings within themselves. And you can see this rocket landed here, and on the outskirts of this is the entrance of what appears to be the basement, where they're using it as a bomb shelter. They have stacked sandbags to protect the windows and the doorway. And you can see where the shrapnel that came off of this. The explosion itself is not always the most dangerous part, but the shrapnel is also extremely dangerous. The metal fragments that fly off that were enclosed. That were enclosing this munition, those metal fragments, they shear off, they fly in every which direction. It's called fragmentation. You can see just what the fragmentation did to these sandbags. I mean, it just tore them into shreds, but they did their job, which is the important part. But it just tore them into shreds, and that's kind of, it gives you kind of an idea of what the shrapnel is doing by itself. And these buildings are not designed with this kind of, purpose in mind. They're not made to withstand these kinds of hits. In Mariupol, the Holodomor monument was destroyed. Russia claims that the Holodomor never happened. Therefore, there's no need to acknowledge any of the victims. So the Holodomor was a man-made famine. It's debated, but it's considered a man-made famine lasting between 1932 and 1933. That resulted in between 3.5 and 5 million people dying of starvation in Ukraine alone, with one of the most heavily affected regions being up in the Kharkiv Oblast. And they so Ukraine does understand this, and this is one of the reasons why one of those concerns regarding the stealing. It's not just the pillaging of the grain and agricultural products of Ukraine that makes Ukraine so upset. It's the fact that there's a historical precedent from the Russians doing this in Ukraine's history, and in some cases, in some Ukrainians' minds, in memorable history, because they were alive when this happened. So this is something that the Soviet Union ended up doing, and this is something that we're kind of seeing once again, especially in these occupied areas where they are taking grain from these regions and they're shipping it back to Russia, which hasn't really been heavily talked about in some time. But RIA Novosti, which is a Russian affiliated news organization, RIA Novosti, it's a government-controlled news organization. They actually went and filmed it. So this is them removing that monument in Mariupol because it never happened to the Russians. And so, and they talk on it.
С историческими источниками голод охватывал южные регионы России, а потом и Советского Союза каждые несколько десятков лет. Наиболее пострадали от голода 1932-1933 года совсем не Украина и совсем не Донбасс. Наиболее пострадал Казахстан, Поволжье, наиболее пострадал Северный Кавказ. И Украина, она стоит на предпоследнем месте по количеству пострадавших на общее количество населения в регионе.
Мы сносим не памятник, а...
I can only listen to these Russian interviews so long, but that is the fact is they destroyed the Holodomor monument. Memorial, really, there in Mariupol. And to see kind of the ideology and swing here in Mariupol, indoctrination has already begun. This is very Stalinist, and the indoctrination of children into military corps. This is like in Russia. Think of an ROTC and then inject it with steroids. Russian from a very young age, Russian children from a very young age, these children are being taught how to operate weapon systems, and to include RPGs, AK-47s, AK-74s, and many other basic weapon systems that are in use within the Russian military. And this is something that Russia does inside of its own country, and it prepares them for conscription. That is the point. It prepares children for conscription and military service. And this is something that is done in Russian youth to an extent have actually opposed this, especially in colleges and universities where the ROTC is a little bit more driven to making them Russian officers. And it seemed, while it is volunteer, it's more or less forceful. And that's kind of what we're seeing here in Mariupol, where that step has already been taken. And you can see here all the way at the end just how young they go. Now, I have no problem with an ROTC program. I always, when I was in school, I wanted an ROTC program, and then I actually went and joined the military, and then I looked at ROTC and went, wow, that's dumb. But, ROTC programs can be good, but the extent to what Russia uses it and the purpose of what Russia uses it for, which is more of indoctrination of youth, less than a volunteer kind of thing, really, really irks me. Because it really prepares child soldiers. And you see this ideology in Mariupol not just because of that, but also because of look at what Kadyrov did. He sent his children, 13, 14, and 15-year-old boys, into Ukraine to fight. That is happening. He did that. We have video evidence of him doing that. That's how far that mindset has gone inside of Russia. We also see the "do the last war over again" syndrome. Thank you for Potential History for giving me that phrase, because for those who don't know, Potential History is absolutely hilarious with their meme tank series, but very informative, and I really like his channel. But we see "do the last war over again" syndrome popping up on the Russians. Now, we have seen all sorts of weaponry being used by the Russians. In fact, we've seen the Vickers machine gun at least being used in training and in some rear echelon posts here on both sides of the war. It's pretty obvious the sign that the Russian forces are not faring very well because they're fielding troops with World War II equipment. It's getting older and older. T-62s are being used in active combat, and I'm not talking about modernized versions. No, bare bones, bare Cold War homogeneous steel T-62s are being fielded onto Ukrainian battlefields to fight against Ukraine because modern tanks have run out. They have apparently run out of everything as well, as we're seeing the SSH-39 and 40 helmets on these Russian soldiers in this photo and video set. And they're carrying the model 1891 Mosin Nagant, which carries a 5-round box magazine. That carries a 5-round internal box magazine. It was used extensively during the Russo-Japanese War in the early 1900s, lasting until about 1904. During World War I, the Russian Revolution and subsequent Civil War, the Winter War, and as well as World War II, in which case now it mostly sees service in ceremonial roles, and also with rebel groups and insurgencies all throughout the world. In fact, we've even seen them used in Afghanistan against U.S. and coalition forces, but not by Russia. This is not something Russia does. Like, they don't use these weapons extensively anymore. They phase them out for the AK series as soon as physically possible, and that is what we see here. Is they're using the Mosin Nagant. See this? These are SSH-39 and 40 helmets. These were used by Soviet troops during World War II. They replaced the SSH-35 and 36 series helmets, which were known for their brittleness and were very ineffective as combat helmets. These replaced them in the series. There was later series such as the SSH-60, which really had no serious improvement on these helmets. But these are SSH-40s. You can clearly identify those as they no longer have the lump here, and because of their liner, which they do not have a much more modern standard of liner. And what this man is holding right here, this is a Mosin Nagant M1891 bolt action rifle. That is what this guy is carrying. Take a look. And we can see it's not just him. His buddy at least has an AK. Looks like an actual AK-47 instead of a 74, but an AK nonetheless. And you can see this guy is also wearing, so SSH-40, SSH-40, SSH-40. Turns around, SSH-40. All of these guys are wearing SSH-40s. This guy's even got this is an entrenching tool. This is a canvas cover for the entrenching tool, which is also likely from the 60s at least. And they're probably wearing armor that was meant for the 70s and 80s. And the plates inside of them are likely do not have any protection, as we have seen from Ukrainian forces capturing these things and literally bending them with their hands. They offer essentially little to absolutely no meaningful types of protection. That means you have lost the war. At this day and age, where the AK is produced by so many countries, you have to have a small book to identify where they come from. The one pioneered, the Kalashnikov, pioneered by the Russians post-World War II, and they do not have enough to field. They do not have the logistical capability to field good enough maintained AK-47s, AKMs, AK-74s, AK-102s and 109s and 112s to their forces to actually fight in this war. That shows a complete logistical breakdown of the Russian logistics systems. They are incapable of supplying their forces to fight a war. That is the situation. That is the situation. They cannot supply their forces to continue to fight a war. Guys going into combat with Mosin Nagants does not identify success. Guys using World War II steel pot helmets from the Soviet Union does not identify success. Guys using flak jackets that not even the Russian army wants to use because they were so outdated they found a replacement for it, using old flak jackets that likely do not have any real plates inside of them, does not identify success. This is logistical failure, logistical breakdown. You can win a battle, and I've said it before, you can win a battle with the ammunition you have on hand. You can do it. You can take a city with the ammunition you have on hand. It'll suck. But when that battle is over, if no one is there to get you more ammunition, to get you more food and water and medical supplies, and if you can't tourniquet yourself when you are hit so you can continue fighting without worrying about bleeding out, then you've lost. Because that counterattack is going to demolish you. Wars are won by logistics and economies. As much as I pride myself on winning the battle, wars aren't won that way. It's based on logistics and economies, and the Russian logistics show in their actions and in the equipment that is being fielded their incapability of continuing to fight a war and make any meaningful progress because their troops' equipment, your average infantryman, their equipment is so horrendous that they are combat ineffective before they even get to the battlefield. That is the situation here for Russian forces. And these are Russian forces. These ones, while we have them just being in the Donbass in general, because we cannot guarantee, these are reportedly Russian troops going to reinforce Kherson. Reportedly. Once again, we can't independently confirm that. FL Treasure says, meanwhile, Russia currently occupies 20% of former Ukraine. It is still Ukraine. It's not former. It is still Ukraine. It's just occupation. It's just occupied territory. Now, that is the situation on the battlefield for the Russians, logistically. World War II helmets. We see immediate retreat. So this is some combat footage coming from the Russian side, actually, of a very small counteroffensive that was taking place, mostly infantry driven here in this area of the Donbass. We don't have any specific areas in the Donbass as to where this is taking place. This is some Russian combat footage, and it's an immediate retreat. It was an immediate, okay, let's go do this. Actually, never mind. So just take a look. You'll see what I'm talking about.
Тоже 300. Нормально? Поставить, все, есть, давай, пошли отсюда.
And so, as you can see, that immediately did not go very well. The other guy just left. The other guy just left that guy for dead. You know, well, he's wounded, he's screwed. He just left him for dead, and that really shows you the battlefield mentality there. Of, you know what? Well, that's his problem now. And the other guy is over there, and he doesn't go to check him and put on a tourniquet or anything. No, he says, "Give me the RPG-26." Yeah, that's a great way to let your friends die. real big morale booster there. As you see, that was a rather unsuccessful counterattack. Up here in Dnipro, more missile strikes did hit Dnipro as Russia continues its campaign of terror, launching very extensive missile strikes on Dnipro and other cities throughout Ukraine, and supposedly targeting critical infrastructure. Is pretty obvious that they are, but also hitting pretty much whatever they can manage to hit, including apartment complexes. Take a look. Once again, as you can see on the left side of the screen, well, one, they hit a river. Way to go, guys. And two, accuracy. Two, they hit what appears to be a power plant as well. So that's obviously still going towards they're striking critical civilian infrastructure, critical infrastructure in general, mostly the energy grid of Ukraine. Down in Hadar, Russian army ended up shelling its own occupied city and then blaming Ukraine. The shelling hit the city council building as well as residential buildings and a small substation. Locals report that they saw that the fire came from occupied nearby villages. Let me get to see those strikes here. And you see what that destruction did up close. Blowing off several different panels of the building. Once again, locals report that the fire was coming from nearby villages. Just across the river here, and in the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, we see that the UN delivered aid to 11,000 people here. This is in the city of Marhanets, which is in the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, just across the river from Hadar. And they delivered food, hygiene, health, and winter supplies to those people in that city, which have been under very significant shelling over the last few months. And that's coming from UNICEF operating there in Ukraine. In the Kherson Oblast, we see that evacuations are beginning, especially in the city of Kherson. While the news of the front lines has been very few and far between, Russian collaboration government officials are ordering the evacuation of the Kherson Oblast. This signifies significant gains by Ukrainian troops and the possibility that Russian forces may be expecting to lose the city in the coming days, which is supported by other analysts from around the world. While not specified, many fear that the evacuations will be forceful, which under the 1949 Geneva Conventions would constitute a war crime. However, Russia so far has blatantly been forcefully deporting Ukrainian civilians to Russia in a move that can only be described as ethnic cleansing in occupied areas. This is actually coming from IZ, which is a Russian state-owned news media organization.
Людей перевозят на другой берег на двух вот таких теплоходах. Это очередь до Голой пристани, вот там чуть правее до Алешек. На месте работают сотрудники МЧС, кинологи с собаками, которые досматривают сумки. На том берегу людей встречают автобусы.
Здесь находятся две очереди людей, которые записывались в колл-центре. По правой стороне находится очередь на Олежке. По левой стороне очередь на Голую пристань. Там людей ожидают автобусы, рассчитаны на 1000 человек. По тому, как люди переправятся, с ними будут дальше уже выяснять, куда они, на Крым, на Краснодар или куда-то дальше.
Собачку решили с собой взять.
So that evacuation is underway. And FL Treasurer said, "What was the strategic importance of that building that got blown up?" So in many of these areas, especially in major cities here, Melitopol, Kramatorsk, Dnipro, Zaporizhia, Kiev, every major city here, whether it's a capital or not. Enhedar is a relatively large city. It's home to the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, which sits on the western quarter of the city. And it's a relatively large settlement within that region. It's one of the largest, aside from Melitopol itself, within the Zaporizhia Oblast and within the occupied area. That being so, the administrative buildings are usually where the regional governments are being run out of, whether that is for just that local regional government, or whether that is for the military coalition government, which is what they would consider in Russia an occupied territory. It's a joint civilian and military government that's in place. It's not a civilian elected government. It's an appointed government appointed by the military and government officials that were appointed by them are operating jointly together within occupied regions. It's not a elected thing, and you see this because even the Russians say the civilian military government in Kherson, or the military or the civilian and military government in Zaporizhia or wherever. Even TASS, RT, Ruptly, and Ria Novosti, IZ. All of them even report that it's a joint military and civilian government there, and that they are appointed ministers, that they're not elected ministers of these governments, despite the fact that it's supposed to be a democracy, mind you. But that is the importance, is that's where the government is being run out of, is the administrative building, and usually that also means that it's also military headquarters. So I hope that answers your question there, Florida Treasure. More drones were shot down, according to Operational Command South of Ukraine. Quote, at night on October the 19th, Ukrainian Air Defense Forces shot down 12 Iranian Shahed 136 kamikaze drones in the Mykolaiv region. And while they may have shot them down, that doesn't mean that strikes still didn't hit Mykolaiv, as we see coming in, or I believe from the 18th. The U.S., they're using converted S-300 missiles, which struck a flower market and residential building, killing at least one person in the barrage, and this is coming from President Zelensky himself on his official Twitter here in Mykolaiv, the regional capital of the Mykolaiv Oblast. The S-300 is an air defense system. It's an air defense missile system, or a SAM, surface-to-air missile. And the Russians, which are running out of stockpiles of long-range ballistic missiles at this point in the war, having used up most of their stockpiles that were allocated for this war effort, at this point have moved to actually using converted S-300 missiles themselves, which converts them from hitting air targets to surface targets. Now, these only have an accuracy of anywhere from 300 to 500 meters of whatever their intended target actually is, which, when you consider the HIMARS missile or the Excalibur round, the HIMARS missile is within 1 meter, meaning it will put a missile between me and my camera, which I am talking to you on. That is the accuracy of the HIMARS. The HIMARS will put, or the Excalibur will put it within 4 meters of its intended target, which is between me and the doorway to the room that I am in, or between me and the bookcase behind me. That is how close the Excalibur round will land to you, and it's a 155 millimeter round. And the HIMARS missile, that will once again within 1 meter, which is between me and the camera. So very accurate. The Russians, S-300, anywhere from 300 to 500 meters, which is actually the max effective engagement distance on a point target for an M4, the M4 carbine, or the M16 A4. That's the max engagement distance on a point target for those systems. In fact, so is 500 meters, 550 meters, depending on the system itself. But very devastating results when being used in highly populated civilian concentrations.
Чергова ракета С-300 вдарила у двоповерховий дім в центрі міста. В результаті утворилася така вирва. На жаль, людина, яка переховувалася у будівлі, у підвалі, загинула. Людину засипало. Будівля стара, удару не витримала.
That was a crater where a house used to be. That was a crater where a house used to be. Direct hit. A direct hit. 300 to 500 meters is not precision. It's not a precision munition. It's not a precision weapon. And using indiscriminate weapon systems outside the scope of a defined military objective, as stated by the 1949 Geneva Conventions, is a war crime. It's also a war crime based off of Protocol 1 of the 1949 Geneva Conventions, adopted in 1977. Which means that the planning of using these weapons is also a war crime. Jump down here to Odessa, where we get a grain corridor update. Another 86.7 thousand tons of Ukrainian agricultural products have been exported since the departure of the first ship. Over 360 ships with 7.9 million tons of foodstuffs on its board have been sent to Asia, Europe, and Africa. This is coming from the Ministry of Agriculture of Ukraine. You can see some of those ships which are loaded up with food and grain stuffs there. Now, Delta Aviation 23 asked a question, and they stated, will Russia leave Kherson, and what will they leave behind if they do? Well, we have precedent for that, and the precedent is normally not good. Kherson has had a very big movement of resistance against Russian occupation. And so, even more so than areas like north of Kiev and Chernihiv, Sumy, Kharkiv Oblast, a lot of partisan activity in Kherson. It's one of the most heavily reported areas of partisan activity. They're very blatant, very obvious, very open about partisan activity. And it wreaks havoc on the Russian forces. As a result, reprisals are likely much higher too. 1 hour reprisals under the Geneva Convention are also consequently, of course, a war crime. Each act of reprisal. So on top of the notable amounts of death and destruction we have seen amongst civilian populations while under occupation by the Russians, the torture, the executions, the rape and sexual assaults, and just the overall mistreatment of individuals and discrimination, it's very terrible. And unfortunately, the side effect of a very strong partisan movement is that will only, I believe, be worse than what was already suspected. The Russians are likely going to be leaving Kherson behind at this point. The situation has become, to an extent, untenable on the part of the Russian forces. They are cut off. They are very heavily pressured. There is not a lot of information that we can verify or really talk to on the front lines. There is a media blackout that has been requested for the Kherson Oblast, and we've been respectful of that request to the best of our ability without leaving too much to the mind. But there is still some information, some tidbits coming out of there that show that the Russians are taking a very heavy beating, and that more significant gains have been made. And as a result, the Russians are admitting openly, in fact, the very first press conference of this new general in charge of the forces here in Ukraine for the Russians admitted that the situation is complex and difficult inside of the Kherson Oblast. So even the Russians are openly admitting that, I think, in preparation for the inevitability that the Russian troops will be withdrawing from that area, as they simply cannot resupply, they cannot re-equip, they cannot reinforce their positions, and that the situation is really untenable north of the Dnieper River. So I think that and the evacuations really talk to that too. Whether they're forced or voluntary, we don't know. But it really suggests that the Russians are considering a full withdrawal, at least from the north side of the Dnieper River. So that's kind of the situation. I do think they will leave. I think it's likely going to be very soon. And I think that as these announcements are coming out, that's only going to hurt morale even more. And that's going to cause them to rout, I think. And we're going to see quite a few... I think we're going to see Kherson possibly fall. I don't suspect days. I mean, it's possible it could be days. It depends on how much pressure is being applied there. But I can see in weeks time frame. In a few weeks, I can see Kherson being completely liberated and that Russian troops completely withdrawn from the north of the Dnieper River. Not the entire oblast, but from the north side of the river, the Dnieper. I believe they will retake up to that. I believe that they will take that. Will they lose tanks in Kherson, or will they take them? They will likely lose them. They really do not have... The bridges are completely destroyed. The crossings there, Novokakovka Dam Bridge, which has seen moderate repairs, but it mostly completely collapsed in one section. The Antonovsky Bridge is essentially completely destroyed. Pontooning across the Dnieper River is very difficult because it's tidal rapids. There on the Dnieper, it has tidal, it raises and lowers with the tides as it being so close to the Black Sea, and it also has a fast-moving current naturally anyway as a river, which makes it very difficult to pontoon bridge across, which is why you see a lot of ferries being used. And so for the rapid movement of troops, the ferries simply would not be able to keep up to withdraw enough equipment in time to then be used in other areas. They will have to leave a significant amount of equipment behind. And I think that when it does happen, if and when it does happen, that the Russians do break, finally, that route will be very much a hasty endeavor that probably will not have any forethought in a tactical retreat at all. It will be a rout. It will not be a tactical withdrawal. And so that is the entirety of Ukraine itself. However, there's plenty of news outside of Ukraine, a lot to deal with the conflict itself. And we actually immediately roll up and into Belarus as we move into the international news, where we actually go back over here. This is into Orsha. Orsha, Belarus, is right here on the Belarusian and Russian border, and we see that more Belarusian military equipment is flooding into Russia. We've seen extensive amounts of military equipment from the Belarusians going into the Russian Federation, mostly tanks and logistical equipment, armored vehicles, artillery systems, and they've been put on flatbed trucks and flatbed trains, and we actually see that here once again. So once again, this is from Orsha, Belarus. You can see that equipment being transported to Russia. So look like a lot of those look like BMP systems mostly. You can see that there's logistical vehicles at the start of the convoy too, and you get into armored vehicles, mostly infantry fighting vehicles for them. Now, this comes as the Belarusians are possibly going to be entering the war as an actual belligerent, as an active combatant, less so as a passive combatant within the conflict. But that remains to be openly seen at this point, as they have not actively engaged in combat so far in the war. Florida Treasure says maybe the most Nagant guy shown earlier was a designated sniper, in which case the rifle might not be entirely obsolete. You had no optics on it though, just iron sights. It's a possibility, or even a designated marksmanship role, but most of the time you're going to see that those are being used with optics of some kind. They would be one of the few in a Russian formation, in a Russian infantry formation. The designated marksman, which Russia does not really adhere to a designated marksman doctrine at all. They mostly adhere to having just a sniper doctrine to it. And you have to keep in mind that any of the conscripted forces within those separatist areas, the occupied areas of Ukraine, any of those forces that have been drawn up are following Russian doctrine. They're following Soviet, because Russia really it's 2014 doctrine. It's really thrown out the window, and it's now going back to the Soviet doctrine. If you look at how they are fighting the war, and the Russians really don't maintain a good infantry doctrine because they don't maintain good infantry. The point of the Russians don't have a light infantry battalions. They don't have light infantry forces. Even if you look at the VDV, which is the Russian version of paratroopers, they even have armored vehicles. The BMDs all have the ability to actually collapse their suspension in order to be able to fit onboard aircraft and brought into a zone in order to support VDV air assault forces and paratroopers. So even the VDV have armored vehicles. They are a mechanized force. The Russians don't maintain any light infantry doctrine. They are a completely mechanized and motorized military force, which is to their detriment. That means that their armor, as you see throughout the duration of the war, operates relatively independently. And as a result, because it's independent and not supported by infantry, makes them very easy targets for anti-armor systems, even light and medium anti-armor systems, which have devastating effects on armored vehicles of the Russian caliber. On average, the armor on a BMD, BMP, infantry fighting vehicles, BTRs as well, only ranges between 12 and 25 millimeters thick, whereas tanks, usually with their slopes, usually have about a meter thick of armor. But even then, these are operating independently. It makes them very easy pickings because armored vehicles inherently do not have good situational awareness on the battlefield. It makes them very easy targets for Javelin Hunter killer teams, or now in-law Hunter killer teams, which I really don't have a whole... it's the same kind of doctrine, but it's not... I never used the in-law personally. But it makes it very... They don't maintain good light infantry doctrine because of their heavy mechanized and motorizations. And so as a result, they don't adhere to like a designated marksmanship doctrine, or they really don't have... They have a sniper corps, but it's not really hard set because it's not really required. They have long-range fires, and they are emphasis on artillery bombardment, precursor bombardment, which is really phase one of a Russian assault. Is heavy precursor bombardment. They field heavy amounts of artillery, the BM-21 Grad systems, the orbital rockets, the everything you see, the D-30s, the everything. 2S3s, 2S1s, Mistas. Very heavy artillery-wise. Saturate an area with bombardment, break their morale, break their will to fight, rattle them up, put them in their holes, provide suppression fires, and then can also bust holes in their line. And that allows for armored forces to drive an armored spearhead, which is why they mechanize so hard, across the flat plains of Russia, which is where they're expecting to fight a war in the 80s. Drive a hard wedge through that line to now be able to outflank, outmaneuver, and exploit gaps in your enemy's line. That's the Russian doctrine on paper. Now, their actual effectiveness in reality, not very good. And we see that with the high casualty rates. We see that with the videos, tons of videos of BMPs, BMDs, tanks all by themselves, and they get immediately lit up with artillery fire and immediately lit up with anti-tank fire, and it really it's like hitting a brick wall over and over again and expecting different results. So no, in the long term, while I did talk about a lot about armor, that's the point. The Mosin Nagant guy, as we've seen throughout this war, Mosin Nagants aren't being used as a sniper role. They're being used... Originally, they were being fielded into rear echelon forces, where they're banning checkpoints. In fact, we even see a T-34 that's sitting in a checkpoint. It's over in Lysychansk. We showed it on air. But they're an armored force. They don't adhere to a light armor to a light infantry doctrine, so snipers aren't going to be heavily utilized. And if they are, they're likely coming from other organizations such as the Spetsnaz, who would actually maintain that kind of a force. At this point in the war, likely not. They don't maintain a designated marksmanship doctrine. Their emphasis is on armor and on artillery, and they really don't maintain much of anything else. Jump over here and into Russia. And I'm actually going to skip Moscow because there's an important bit of news here. And what we see is that this gas station, at this Shell gas station here on the side of the E58 highway, Gherkin was spotted. This is in the Rostov Oblast, just over by Rostov-on-Don. Igor Gherkin, who is an individual of a major suspect of the MH17 downing in 2014, and he also helped orchestrate the occupation and annexation of Crimea. Posted a picture of him was posted online. Now, we've wondered where Gherkin was. Everyone has suspected that he was brought into the military. Once again, that is true. That appears to be true. They're right now, the Ukrainians have pooled money together to fund what has become a $150,000 bounty on Igor Gherkin. But it was traced and geolocated. There you go. There's wonderful Igor himself on the side of the road here in the Rostov Oblast, getting ready to go into Ukraine as a military officer in the Russian military. So they're tracking him. It's like, where in the world is Carmen Sandiego? Where in Europe is Igor Gherkin? So everyone's trying to track him down and has successfully geolocated him to this very spot. In fact, we even posted the coordinates here for you guys if you so wish to check out the map itself. But with that little tidbit, we jump back up and into Moscow, where we get that Russian media slowly preparing the population for the fact that Kherson will be abandoned. And the military correspondent from Komsomolaya, I'm sorry if I butchered that, Pravda, gives a priceless summary. There won't be any good news in the next 2 months, and that's for sure. And that's him being optimistic. Now, it is a little bit of a longer video, so we're only going to show part of it, but...
Военный корреспондент «Комсомольской правды», наш друг и товарищ Александр Коц на прямой связи. Саш, понятно, Херсон, понятно, там все тяжело. С чем связаны основные наши тревоги? Есть ли информация, разведданные по поводу украинской группировки, которая собрана там в кулак, сколько человек, какая техника, к чему готовятся, есть ли понимание, как будут действовать? Почему мы решили увозить людей?
Ну, потому что мы в первую очередь заботимся об их жизнях. Дома, квартиры, это все наживное, это все можно построить. В этом могут убедиться жители Мариуполя. Мы помним, какие тяжелые бои были за этот город. Сегодня там появляются новые кварталы. Здесь, на Херсонщине, ситуация, конечно, очень тяжелая. Все эти месяцы украинская сторона планомерно старалась отрезать нашу группировку от снабжения и в районе дамбы Новой Каховки, и в районе Антоновского моста. То есть сейчас снабжение нашей группировки на том берегу, на левом берегу Днепра, очень осложнено. Оно, конечно, выполняется и через понтонные переправы, и через паромные переправы. Однако полноценного сообщения левого с правым берегом, к сожалению, нет. И это создает трудности для российской военной группировки. Тем более, что по ту сторону линии фронта действительно нам противостоят достаточно серьезные силы. На некоторых участках фронта соотношение численное...
Oof. The enemy outnumbers her forces 4-1. That's not a good admission. But anyway, we're going to cut that one there. They're just talking about how terrible the situation is there. Now, a question did come in from JL. How do you think the Russian attacks on energy and water infrastructure will affect what is happening on the battlefield in the front lines? That is difficult. That is very difficult. So, on the front lines, I don't expect it to affect much. And the reason being is in the frontline areas, for the most part, water, gas, and electricity have been cut off for quite a while now. They really haven't had it for months. And so they're already operating under those relatively terrible conditions, and the civilian population has already been enduring those terrible conditions, cutting off the high levels of the electricity and stuff in areas such as Dnipro, Kharkiv, Kiev is really not going to be affecting the people on the front line a whole lot because their situation doesn't change. Now, what it does do, however, is it does strengthen Ukrainian resolve, because the people in areas such as in Lviv and in Cherkasy and in Chernihiv and Kiev and areas that are up here in the north, especially Vinnytsia, aside from one or two attacks, one-off attacks that happened, such as the massacre there at Vinnytsia, which was absolutely deplorable and still haunts me to this day, the situation in these areas they is relatively normal. Kiev had returned to a relatively normal life for a country at war. It had returned to a relatively normal life. Businesses were open again. Lviv is a huge center for humanitarian aid, for internally displaced people, for people that are leaving, that have left the front lines, that are maybe have evacuated from their homes in other places of Ukraine, but are now coming back, and they're at least staying with friends and family that they may have in Lviv until it's safe to return to their actual homes elsewhere in the country. The people were coming back to Ukraine. They're tired of being refugees. I mean, and who's to blame them? But that is the situation for these people in the north. And now that life has returned to somewhat normal, they are being shelled again. And this, I don't know about you, but it would infuriate the hell out of me. It would make me angry. It would make me curse. It would curse who did this. Curse whoever continues this onslaught that follows my family from one side of the country to another. Curse the people that would do this. And that is really what you are seeing from the populations in these areas, is initially fright, concern, uncertainty, and then it immediately rolls into resolve and resiliency. The bombings that hit Kiev on Monday, not this past Monday, but Monday a week prior, road is paved back over in a day. Most repairs being done throughout the country are immediately, you're going from where millions of people are without power to just small pockets are without power, because repairs are being immediately done. Immediately are getting done in these regions, which is because the security situation allows for it. But these attacks are not demoralizing Ukrainian forces. They're not demoralizing the Ukrainian population. They're having the opposite effect of their intention. While it is terrorism, it's not effective terrorism. It's similar to what you saw post 9/11, when the World Trade Center was attacked, when the World Trade Center was attacked, when the Pentagon was attacked, when Shanksville, Pennsylvania, the airliner crashed there. There was fear. There was a lot of fear. There was a lot of, sadness in the air, of course, because a lot of 2,700 people just lost their lives in a day. It's a huge attack. Worst attack since Pearl Harbor, which brought the United States into World War II. But immediately, you saw the immediate effects of what happens next, and that is that the United States immediately goes into Afghanistan. Special Operations Forces are boots on the ground in Afghanistan less than a month later. They're in Afghanistan. They're fighting with the Northern Alliance. They have linked up with the Northern Alliance. They're fighting the Taliban. They're fighting Al-Qaeda. They're chasing down bin Laden. They're retaking northern territories, so as Mazar-e Sharif. And they're, and then immediately you're seeing ground forces getting deployed in 2002. Once mobilization has started for the United States, you're seeing, invasion forces actually hitting the ground in Afghanistan in a matter of months, really taking the Taliban out of power in Afghanistan, and then beginning to fight an insurgency movement by the Taliban, who are harboring Osama bin Laden. It's resolve. It's immediate resolve. The fear, the terror, it goes away very quickly, and that turns into anger in resolve. And that is what Ukraine is seeing every single time a missile or drone is hitting its target. Every single time Ukrainian civilians are getting killed, it is not making the Ukrainian people waver. It's hardening them to realities what they are facing and making them want to be more aggressive. It's having the opposite of the intended effect. So that is it. So it doesn't change anything on the battlefield, on the front lines. It doesn't change anything, because they don't have that anymore. They don't have water or gas or anything anymore. But it does change the perception. It gives them the resolve even more so, that it makes them even more encouraged to be more aggressive in their actions, to fight harder. And that is where you're going to see it, is in the battlefield mentality, not necessarily in the physical situation. Rooster Cyberds, is Israel going to sell Ukraine the Iron Dome system? No. Israel is not going to sell Ukraine the Iron Dome system. Sorry, it's a very short answer, but they already denied it just a couple days ago. IIRC Japan promised a ton of aid in the way of power infrastructure equipment. That is very true. They did. Yeah. So Rooster. They are not going to supply the air defense system, or they're not going to supply the Iron Dome system. And while the Iron Dome is really good, it's really good for Israel. It's not necessarily really good for Ukraine. While Ukraine could really take whatever it can get, because they they say, we only have 10% of what we need. Israel is a much smaller place to defend, which means that all of these systems that they have everywhere are much more saturated. They can cover a much better area. They have better interlocking fields of fire. So it makes it a lot easier for Israel's to be so effective, because it doesn't have to cover, it doesn't have to cover thousands of square, nearly as much land masses as Ukraine. And that's the beauty of it, it doesn't have to cover a lot, but it's really effective. It's really good at intercepting projectiles, but it's easier to detect and track, and you have multiple systems within very close proximity to properly engage this system, to engage whatever shells are coming into your area, and it has a much better reaction time. And really, it blankets the entirety of Israel with these systems. But with Ukraine, it's a lot bigger landmass, and there's multiple threats that you have to keep in mind. The Iron Dome is great for smaller projectiles and rockets, but what about the drones? What about the ballistic missiles, the larger munitions that are flying much higher than most other munitions are going to go? What about the aircraft that are flying around Ukraine? What about if it detects a friendly aircraft and attempts to shoot it down, because it's a largely automated system? That's kind of what you're seeing. You're not seeing quite nearly as much of a... There's a lot more complicated things that go into it. Not all of it I fully understand, because it's not really my section of expertise. But there's a lot of things that you have to account for with these systems, and the Iron Dome doesn't necessarily make it the most effective system for Ukraine. While it could be effective for, as John Collier pointed out here, they could surround Kiev with the Iron Dome system, or Chernihiv, or any of these cities, but that only gives one city, and it's a lot of focus in one city. Whereas you need to give a lot of focus to because not everyone lives in Kiev. There's just a lot of other areas you got to worry about. And you also have to think about the air defense capabilities. And what we see from Ukraine is a defense in depth, which is they have multiple sections of air defense in different parts of the country. So as things get closer and closer to their targets, such as in Kiev, if they're coming from the Black Sea, they have to cross all the air defense systems all throughout the country, all the way to Kiev, and they have multiple rings, essentially, of air defense systems. So even if it penetrates one, it doesn't necessarily penetrate the other. So what they need is more, and saturation is still a problem, because even the Iron Dome can become oversaturated with enough artillery going off at the same time and a big enough barrage. They simply cannot accurately track enough targets and accurately engage enough targets to be 100% effective, which is why it doesn't have a 100% effective rate. And it's the same issue here. They're firing 40-something drones at the same time, plus 30-something ballistic missiles and cruise missiles. And that is just even with what limited air defense coverage Ukraine has, they're shooting down a majority of those, but they simply cannot get them all because it's just too much at the same time. That's really what they're dealing with. And they're still having to support operations on the front lines where aircraft are being used heavily by both sides still. And they're conducting air patrols. They're supplementing air defenses with aircraft, which would be another big thing that Ukraine could really use is getting resupplies and stuff for their aircraft too, and getting more aircraft into the fight to replenish losses that they have taken. So there's multiple routes to go, but just because Israel's not giving the Iron Dome, I don't think it's a huge loss. I mean, anything would be great right now for Ukraine air defense wise, but the system works well for Israel doesn't necessarily mean it fits for Ukraine. And there's other systems that would be more versatile and I think more effective in its major roles than the Iron Dome system. Because the Iron Dome is, like I said, really great for rockets, really great for mortar rounds, not so great for ballistic missiles and jet aircraft and drones. As we continue here in Russia, data reveals a rather hidden agenda. In light of recent losses in Ukraine, Russian media are changing up its strategy by writing about each air alert to please the average viewer. Ukraine World, this is coming statistics from our colleagues there at Texiorga. There has been more focus on air alerts. Once again, this really highlights, this is pretty cool data to actually look at on a graph. But what you see is patterns. And this is something that you see even if you just read through it. I didn't need a graph to tell me this. But we here at the New News also follow Russian sources. We have an entire page dedicated to just Russian sources, so we can see what is Russia saying, what is their news saying, what is their government saying. We have the ability, we can look at the legal documents that they're providing, and we do have Fair. If you're in the live chat here, you can see Fair, who's talking, is actually our translator and can reads and writes fluent and speaks fluent Russian and Ukrainian. So they are very, and so they're able to actually, so we're able to actually read this stuff and see what's going on, get this stuff accurately translated, and you can see the patterns showing up in Russian media, and this goes all the way back. This is a really great illustration of dis and misinformation campaigns and propaganda. Now, both sides, you have to understand, while we do heavily report off of Ukrainian sources, obviously, when it comes to the war in Ukraine, because we do maintain a very clear bias for Ukraine, and it's very explicitly stated as such, that both sides are in an information war. Both sides are doing propaganda to an extent, and that's just a fact of how these wars work. And the different types of battlefields, not just the physical one, but the cyber battlefield, really, the information war. So, my personal belief, I believe the casualty rates that Ukraine puts out are inflated. I believe that they have not verified that many killed in action, even in their estimates. But that is either out of a lack of, that could be just because of misunderstandings. According to battlefield casualty reports from the Gulf War, in the war in Iraq, 2003 invasion, we killed the Iraqi army. According to battlefield commanders, the United States killed the Iraqi army 7 times over. according to their battle damage assessments are immediately given in their briefings and in their reports after making contact with the enemy during the invasion of Iraq. We killed the Iraqi army 7 times over. So what we start seeing is information, but Ukraine is inflating those numbers intentionally or unintentionally, is the take that we have. Russia is purposely deflating those numbers. They're not really releasing any casualty information. What casualty information they have released has either been accidental and leaked, or it's been extremely low for what the expectations are. Just based off of the blatant footage that we have from this war being one of the most well documented in history. Russian media will show trends. You'll see that almost word for word in many ways they talk about certain things in the same type of way. They'll talk about the same type of incident over and over again. They'll use the same photos over and over again for different things of shelling, but it doesn't matter if you look at TASS, or you look at RIA, or you look at Ruppli, or you look at RT, or you look at IZ, or you look at the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, you look at the Russian consulate in New Zealand, you look at the Russian consulate in Great Britain and Northern Ireland and the United Kingdom, you look at the Russian Ministry to the UN in Geneva, or if you look at the Russian, the UN representative in New York City, it will be a little bit different, but generally speaking, they all have the exact same information along the exact same lines. So it's very interesting to see. You almost use down to the same wording in many ways, and it's just kind of eerie. You can almost put on the videos, you can almost put a compilation together where you can hear them almost saying the exact same thing at the exact same time. It's pretty crazy. But you can see the uptick here and them talking about air raid alerts in Ukraine. Why? Because it's good news for the Russians. It's good news to them. It means that something's happening, their army is doing something, and it's actually making some kind of a difference in the country, in the war, regardless of if that's accurate or not. For the Russian civilian who is not on the front line, who is not fighting in the war, that isn't getting contact with their son or daughter or husband or whoever is on the front lines there, this is perception, and perception is reality to them. And you're going to see an uptick as things aren't going the way they want it to. They're going to go, okay, wait, don't look there, look over here. Look over here. And seeing as the government controls all of the media that in the country, because they quite honestly censored and banned all other independent media sites at the beginning of the war, they can push whatever narrative that they want. And you even see these connotations on Twitter too, where it says Russian state affiliated media, where even like Twitter and other organizations, independent corporations, are recognizing, yeah, this is happening. China, same thing. Chinese news organizations, and with Iran, it actually will give you a warning on Twitter if someone is using one of their links. Putin announced martial law in occupied regions. Putin says he's introducing martial law in 4 partially occupied Ukrainian regions he annexed last month. This portrayed as a technicality. He said a de facto already exists, but is a clear response to recent military setbacks as Ukraine's counteroffensives advance. Putin's martial law in occupied regions is preparation for mass deportation of Ukrainians in depressed to Russia's depressed areas in order to change ethnic composition of occupied territory. Ukraine's Secretary of National Security, Alexei Danilov, stated. This is up here. This is in Koryolov, which is in the general Moscow area. And it says, gotta start them young. Russian soldiers visited daycare to entertain kids with guns and film a promo for their propaganda channel. I wish we were kidding. This is a daycare. This is a daycare. Now, as a child, this would have been awesome. However, looking at it as an adult, this is messed up. This is a daycare. a day. I was not kidding. Indoctrination in Russia starts young. It wasn't just Mariupol. Look at this. Take a look at this video. This is... Jeez. So it's got some copyright music, but you can see they brought out these are live weapons. Except, these RPG 26s are probably not live. But he's got RPG 26s, he's got AKs, and this is screwed up. Awesome for the kids, but screwed up when you look at it as an adult and go, what in the hell? Bradley Evans says, what map site is that? I use Google My Maps. That is what I use to put this map together every night. There is another one. I cannot remember it off the top of my head. But it is... Oh, jeez. Now you're going to make me go find it. Let's see. www.map.army. And what that is it actually gives you a map that you can use NATO identification markers, and also so that way you can identify military formations. And so you can actually set up a map on that, and it actually is for military like planning. So it's really cool. But yeah, so that's another one that I'm actually looking at using possibly here in the future if I can get it to work well enough. But it's not as interactive as this. I use this because I find it very interactive. And also, if I really wanted to, something else I can do is I can do this. Or I can bring it into a Google Earth view for you guys. I can actually bring it to a 3D version where you guys can actually see everything going on here on the front lines from a Google Earth view. Now, I don't personally like this view. It doesn't give a super. It really doesn't benefit anything from an accuracy standpoint onto what's happening here, and it's also not as interactive. But yes, that is the map that I use for those that are interested. And if you guys like this, even though it's not as interactive, please let me know. But you can also do this yourselves if you are interested and you want to check out the map on our website. Anyway, back to the normal map. We jump up here to Estonia, where we see that the Minister of Foreign Affairs has a very simple answer to this DW reporter during an exclusive interview. Take a look. This is a DW interview, which is a German news organization. A very good organization. I like listening to them personally. I do so at lunch, but take a look.
Would you like to see Vladimir Putin go to jail?
To hell.
For those that may have missed it, she asks him, Would you like to see Vladimir Putin go to jail? And he has a very short and simple response. This is the Minister of Foreign Affairs for Estonia.
Would you like to see Vladimir Putin go to jail?
To hell.
His response, to hell. Would you like to see Vladimir Putin go to jail? To hell. Well, at least we know where Estonia stands. And I believe that's very firmly with Ukraine. And as we jump over here, this is actually over near Denmark waters, where we take a look at damage caused by powerful explosions here on the Nord Stream pipeline. So in the first video and photo evidence of the Nord Stream pipeline and the damage which has been caused to it, was actually released today, and we can actually see some of that here. Reportedly, it was caused by large explosions that could only be done, according to the Swedish government right now. They're saying it could only be done with explosive materials. That is what they're saying, which is once again pointing to an act of sabotage. Once again, DW News also releasing some of this. This is that video footage here for you guys. Take a look. You can see the destruction. These are very thick pipes. These are not very thin. And you see they're canted outward, meaning it was that explosion happened from within. And that's right about what we're seeing. These explosions are occurring. And in Berlin, we're seeing that the Germany's cyber agency head was fired as a report tying him with Russian intelligence surfaced. This was revealed by German media, not counterintelligence. So we do have that coming. There is an AP or Associated Press article about this. I highly encourage that you read it, but we won't go through that too much here today. As we jump down here and move into Syria and into the Middle East, we end up seeing that Turkish troops are attempting to stop the fighting happening between several different groups here in the northern part of the Aleppo province. Turkish troops were deployed on Tuesday in an area in northwestern Syria to try and stop fighting between rival rebel groups that oppose the Bashar al-Assad's regime, witnesses and rebel forces said. Turkish tanks and armored vehicles have taken up positions around Kafar Khan, a cross-county terrain that the main rebel banned terrorist group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, seized on Monday from two rival factions that are part of the coalition of Ankara-backed forces. And we do have that where that's originally coming from. You can see those Turkish forces there. Moving out of Syria and over to here and into the areas of Iran. You see up here a 16-year-old girl was beaten to death after refusing to sing to the regime. A 16-year-old girl, Asara Panahi, died after a raid by security forces at the Shahid Girls' School. Authorities allegedly forced girls to sing a song praising Iran's supreme leader. When Panahi refused, the teenager was reportedly beaten to death. And in Tehran, an athlete is under investigation. The missing Iranian climbing athlete, Elnaz Rakabi, who competed in the Asian Climbing Championship in South Korea without a hijab, has returned to Iran. Great crowds gathered to meet her at 3 a.m. in the morning. She has reportedly met with the Minister of Sports and is reportedly under investigation for her actions. There's a post on her Instagram account that expressed apology for the worries created and explained that she'd lost her hijab inadvertently when being called unexpectedly to compete. She repeated the same account when being interviewed. And those are the crowds coming to meet her there at the airport. And that is her during her climbing. During her climbing competition. And there she is. And once again, just following up with them regarding the crowds waiting for her. Over in Afghanistan, in the Panjshir Valley, investigation revealed 27 people executed by the Taliban. Afghan witnesses, an open source project run by the UK-based nonprofit Center for Information Resilience, published a report on Tuesday revealing that Taliban forces bound, blindfolded, and shot 27 resistance fighters in Afghanistan's Panjshir Valley last month. The report refuted the claims that by the Taliban that resistance forces died during battle. There's still heavy fighting amongst resistance movements there in the Panjshir Valley, located just north of Kabul. In Jakarta, a mosque caught on fire, and the blaze was unable to be stopped, which caused the structural collapse of the main dome there at the mosque, and it dropped directly into that crippled building. And we can see here that fire that's raising and the main dome collapsing down into the mosque. It's unknown what has caused that fire. All we know is that the fire did in fact start. And so that is the situation there in Jakarta, Indonesia. As we jump over here and into Africa, the World Health Organization is making a plea to the world. The World Health Organization, WHO, made pleas to the world to assist Ethiopia and to pressure Ethiopia and Eritrea to begin peace talks and cease the fighting. In the Tigray region, which has been under siege for nearly 2 continuous years, it continues to see indiscriminate attacks by Ethiopian and Eritrean troops, the denial of humanitarian aid, including the United Nations, and to have access to the region. 90% of the Tigray region relies on humanitarian aid for survival, and children ages 5 and under are the most disproportionately affected. This is coming from the Director General of the World Health Organization. This is his statement regarding this. Take a look.
Earlier this week, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said that, I quote, "The situation in Ethiopia is spiraling out of control. The social fabric is being ripped apart and civilians are paying a horrific price. Hostilities in Tigray must end now, including the immediate withdrawal and disengagement of Eritrean armed forces from Ethiopia." End of quote. The United Nations Human Rights Office has received reports of civilian casualties and destruction of civilian objects due to airstrikes and artillery strikes. Indiscriminate attacks or attacks that deliberately target civilians or civilian objects amount to war crimes. There is no other situation globally in which 6 million people have been kept under siege for almost 2 years. Banking, fuel, food, electricity, and healthcare are being used as weapons of war. Even people who have money are starving because they can't access their bank for 2 years. Children are dying every day from malnutrition. There are no services for tuberculosis, HIV, diabetes, hypertension, and more. Those diseases which are treatable elsewhere are now a death sentence in Tigray. Yes, I'm from Tigray, and yes, this affects me personally. But my job is to draw the world's attention to crises that threaten the health of people wherever they are. This is a health crisis for 6 million people, and the world is not paying enough attention. I urge the international community and the media to give this crisis the attention it deserves. There is a very narrow window now to prevent genocide.
That's coming from the World Health Organization, or WHO, and Dr. Tedros, who is the Director General of the World Health Organization. So the only crisis ongoing in Africa, here in a region of South Sudan, heavy flooding has displaced thousands of people. This is coming out of heavy flooding in Abyei, South Sudan, has displaced thousands of people already struggling with shortages of food and clean drinking water, as well as many other basic services. This is coming from the United Nations. Keep in mind, many of these people were already living in refugee camps and are now completely displaced with nothing left. Chad is also seeing very heavy flooding over the last few days and weeks, and we're seeing that the heavy flooding has affected over 1 million people in the country of Chad. Torrential flooding throughout Chad affected more than 1 million people, according to the United Nations. So far, support has been provided to 200,000 people by humanitarian missions throughout the region. And that brings us over to our last point here in North America. And it's a very heavy-hitting point indeed. Latest report to the UN investigation into Ukraine. The United Nations Independent International Committee of Inquiry on Ukraine, as created by the UN Human Rights Council, has submitted its finalized report on the initial phase of investigation regarding the war in the northern part of Ukraine, namely Kiev, Chernihiv, Sumy, and Kharkiv Oblast. It has documented immense war crimes, abuses, and violations of international law by the Russian Federation. While there was evidence that Ukraine also committed war crimes and broke international humanitarian law, the degree in which Russian atrocities were committed left Ukrainian violations as little more than a footnote in the report. Evidence found that murder, unlawful detainment, unlawful deportation, sexual assault, rape, torture, deliberate targeting of fleeing civilians, uses of banned or restricted munitions were rampant by the Russian side. Individuals, mostly family members, including children, were forced to watch the rape and sexual assault of their loved ones. Many are reported missing, and Russian warfare has indiscriminately affected them all. If you're interested in actually reading that report, which I please advise you, there's some discretion to that. It's a very hard report to read. I did end up reading it while I was researching tonight. It's very hard to read. That we have the English version there. The version, there's 3 different languages, I believe. Russian, English, and French is what languages are provided for you. But it's a very hard. It's hard to read. But that is all of the news throughout the world for today. At least the ones coming from our sources. I hope that you guys find that this is knowledgeable and that you find that this is this brings good awareness to the situations happening throughout the globe and in the world around you. There's millions of people affected by these conflicts the last report prior to this year's was that 80 million people require humanitarian aid throughout the world. That number jumped to 345 million in the past year. Millions, hundreds of millions of people. To give you an instance, 345 million people is more than the population of the United States. And with that, I hope that you, your family, and your friends remain safe. And if not, I do hope that you find that safety and security in the very near future. Please be sure, if you can, to check out the video description below and to please give your support to those wonderful organizations we have listed. And if you have more, especially in areas we may not cover, please send them to us. Jump onto our Discord and send us links in a short description as to what that organization does. We'll start getting that vetting process started. 80% or more of the donations that those organizations receive go directly to their programs and to helping people throughout the world deal with these horrific situations that they find themselves in. And if you can't give a lot to these organizations, please give a little. And if you can't give anything at all, that's okay too. Please help us raise more awareness and to have a greater impact by sharing this channel and this news with other people throughout the world and giving us that like, subscribe. It immensely helps the channel, and the more people that are here, the more of an impact this community will have. Thank you very much for the support you've already given us, and I hope that you will be back with us here on Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern Time and 9 p.m. Central for yet another 48 hours of news in review. In the meantime, please be safe. Please enjoy a wonderful Thursday and a very happy Friday until we see you on Friday night. And I will hopefully see you back here on Friday. With that, my name is Paul from the New News, and have a fantastic rest of your night, everybody.
Going home, Russian soldiers, going home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. І стріляє до волновахи, і чудно кличе, діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТРО. Нам не треба ні конфлікту, ні війни. Та ми готові всіх вас звать до сатани. Тисячі вже полягло, і все більше шлепуємо. Тут для них нема нічого, крім труни. Going home, Russian soldiers, going home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. І стріляє до волновахи, і чудно кличе, діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТРО. Вызволять пришел, братишка, ну привет. На моей земле тебе один ответ. Нашим людям с кирпичом, даже танки и бочок. Вам не взять нас и за 100 000 лет. Going home, Russian soldiers, going home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. І стріляє до волновахи, і чудно кличе, діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТРО.
Mr. Putin, on behalf of all our guys, no one's scared of your nuclear device. You can take your double and shove it up your wrinkled bum. Oh, we'll come and help you fit it in your skull.
Going home, Russian soldiers, going home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. І стріляє до волновахи, і чудно кличе, діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТРО. Going home, Russian soldiers, going home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. І стріляє до волновахи, і чудно кличе, діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТРО. Russian soldiers going home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. І стріляє до волновахи, і чудно кличе, діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТРО. Going home, Russian soldiers going home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. І стріляє до волновахи, і чудно кличе, діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТРО. Ідіть нахуй.